much for that. Appreciate you joining in with that perspective. Devin Choksi is also now joining us. Devin, good to have you with us here as always. I mean, so yeah, I mean, as Rahul pointed out, you got a situation where it's not conclusive one way or the other, right? Rallies are being sold, dips are being bought, but without any substantive break on either side. Maybe it will remain like that, right? I mean, markets can do that for a while. It doesn't necessarily have to run away in either direction. How likely is that near term in your opinion?
Yeah, Prashant, good afternoon. Well, I think the current rally in the market, as I typically see, is I think a bounce back to the fall that it has had in the earlier quarter, in which I think largely the sell-off took place because of I think the collateral losses, collateral damages. I think that they had to pay for, particularly the FIs. I think when they incurred losses in other asset classes. So I think that was a reason for sell-off, and I think from that perspective, I think market was justified in that sell-off. Today, I think the recovery in the market is on 2-3 counts. And on one side, the new funds have started coming into the market from global investors. Once again, I think they're buying at a lower levels, largely because of the better prospects in the economy as well as in the growth of the corporate sector. Second most important aspect, I think, as we believe that I think inflation management comparatively in India is better as compared to other parts of the world. That gives higher amount of confidence to majority of the global players to I think bring money into the market. And India has a structural story from investment point of view, both in infrastructure as well as in the industry. I think it's attracting a lot of new investment. So all in all put together, this recovery in the market has taken place. Now for the market to break out, I think from current levels, certainly would require a couple of quarters of sustained and higher growth performance as far as earnings are concerned. Last quarter earnings have been relatively stable and better. I think this particular quarter, you might see some influence of fluctuating commodity prices into the earnings. And I think there may be some situation where I think some of the sectors may not probably, I think, give enough amount of earnings in this particular quarter. Having said that, I think the second half of the financial year looks relatively more promising. So if the market is to do the breakout, then possibly I think it would be on a positive news of inflation under control, interest rate not rising, and higher food production coming out, which could possibly suggest that the better opportunity is there in the second half of the year. So I think these are some of the reasons which one will have to wait till the breakout takes place as far as the upside is concerned.
Okay, all right. Well, by the way, the markets are trying to conquer that 17,600 odd mark, but from the top we saw some bit of selling. A couple of stocks have taken a bit of a leg down. Britannia has moved lower, so keep an eye out on that one. The bigger boy, Infosys as well as Reliance Industries, with the intraday chart should come up of both those two. Remember, they're larger weights. When they take a leg down, then that puts some bit of pressure as well. Infosys days low, even Reliance Industries at the day's low as we speak. But let's focus on a couple of other names then. Mangalore Chemicals is in focus as sources tell us that Zuari Agro is in talks to sell its stake in the company to Chambal Fertilizers. Nisha joins us to fill us in with more on that. Nisha?
Thanks for that. Yes, when we earlier broke the story, Zuari Agro as well as Chambal Fertilizers stocks had seen a spike on the back of this particular news break. Now, what we are gathering from sources with direct knowledge is that there's a massive reorganization in the Advent's group, which owns all three companies, that is Zuari Agro, Mangalore Chemical, as well as Chambal Fertilizers. Way back in 2015, Zuari Agro had bought Mangalore Chemicals, in which it owns 54% stake, and now we gather from sources with direct knowledge that Zuari Agro is looking to offload its stake and the entire holding in Mangalore Chemicals to Chambal Fertilizers. Now remember, this is even though a group reorganization, because it's the same group promoter entity, Saroj Poddar-led group, but on the other hand, all three are separately listed entities, and the transaction will have to be done on the bourses at arm's length as separately listed entities. Another aspect that I gathered from sources with direct knowledge is that Zuari Agro is taking this step after buying Mangalore Chemicals in a hotly contested battle back then, is because it wants to raise funds in order to pay back its debt. So these are the details really coming out. We do gather that an investment bank has also been hired in order to really carry on this particular restructuring process. And when we look at the overall group, then 60 to 65% stake is held by the Advent Group in each of the three companies that are operating in similar space. And on the other hand, Zuari Industries also has cross-holding in these particular companies as well. But Chambal Fertilizers as well as Zuari Agro, these are the two transacting parties for Mangalore Chemicals shares, is what we gather from sources.
Okay, all right, Nisha, thanks a lot for joining in and filling us in with those details. Stocks clearly spiked up once Nisha, broke that story. Devin, coming across to you, what's your view on this developing story and how would you approach these stocks?
So, Nigel, I think since we don't have the coverage on the companies, I would refrain from making the viewpoint on the company. But as a overall story, I think in the fertilizer space, currently, due to many of the plants, I think particularly those who are producing the ammonia, I think are going to be in favor largely because of, I think, the supplies to European market due to the stoppage of production over there under the circumstances of crude oil shortage, etc. So I think that is one of the reasons for which I think most of the fertilizer companies which are having the ammonia production are likely to see the benefit in the coming quarters. And that is where probably I think one could argue that I think as a commodity, one would possibly see relatively better results in 1 or 2 quarters hereafter. But that's it. That is what I think one could basically look at, I think, as a near-term outlook for these companies. Beyond that, I think the regular business of the companies, since we are not tracking them, I would not be able to make a comment on it.
Okay, got that. Do you any thoughts on what's happening with names like Mazgaon Dock? Devin, do you track this one? It's up 13-14%.
Not really, I think, not looking into this particular space.
Okay. The other space is fertilizers, which are jumping up a little bit. Chambal, for example, is up about 6%. Coromandel has been doing fairly. It sold off yesterday. It's back up today. RCF and a few others. We had the Fertilizer Association, head of the Fertilizer Association of India with us earlier today. On this, of course, this government rule on one India, one branding for fertilizers. But more importantly, we also quizzed him about, the shortage of gas and, of course, shortage of things like ammonia because of plants in Europe, etc., shutting down. I mean, his point was that at the end of the day, it's up to the government. I mean, they'll have to up the subsidy that they offer to farmers so that companies can raise prices to compensate for these increased costs. Any thoughts at all, Devin, on this space?
So, as a sector, I think, Prashant, since I think the fertilizer is a state subject, largely I think the government policy influences, I think, the business of these companies. And I think, as we have maintained all along, I think any business in which I think the government has a very direct intervention, I think stay away from taking them into the investment portfolio. And that's what we do with most of the fertilizer companies. I think we don't find enough amount of excitement because over there with the strike of a pen, I think they change the entire fortune of the company, I think, at times. I think that is where probably I think one would not like to, I think, add this kind of stocks into the portfolio.